Hello, and welcome to the third session of our virtual reading group discussion of Hannah Arendt's essay on violence. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. In sections 1 and 2, Hannah Arendt sets up the question of on violence in section 1 by asking, well, why is this sudden interest? She's writing in the 1960s. Why this sudden interest in violence? And she suggests that it comes out of an experience of doomsday, an experience of the feeling that the technological advances of our world are creating a kind of fatalism, and that violence is one answer to a way to act and upset and interrupt that fatalism of doomsday and of progress that is leading us to our demise. And she says at the end of part 1 that if violence were the only way to stop this sort of fated process, we would have to support it, but it's not. There's also something else called action, which can interrupt these inevitable processes. Part 2 then distinguishes violence from power, power being a way of acting in concert with others. And so she tries to argue that there are other ways to act and interrupt processes, and namely political action or power and the acting together with others in a common goal, towards a common goal, is such an event. The third section is where she actually attempts to answer the question, what is violence? Once we've said that there's a reason why people are interested in violence in the part 1, and violence is not power in part 2, okay, well then what is violence? And so part 3 itself is divided into 2 parts, we should note, and it's really only in the second part, which is very short, only about 6 or 7 pages, where she actually gets to the question, what is violence? And so on page 176, using again the edition from the collection Crises of the Republic, she will finally give us a definition of violence. It's similar to one she said before in part 1, but in essence, she says violence, being instrumental by nature, is rational to the extent it is effective in reaching the end that must justify it. Violence is instrumental. It serves some end, and it is rational. It's not irrational, right? Violence is not some crazy, irrational thing. It's rational, and it serves to reach and justify an end, or to reach an end that must justify the violence. And so that is going to be, and she only starts that on page 176. It then begins the discussion at the end. We'll come back there. I just wanted to point that out. The first parts of this third part, the first few pages of this first part, actually almost 20 pages, is a setup in many ways to that. And she begins by simply saying, well, God, everybody's talking and writing about violence today. All these social scientists, primarily, she calls them polemologists, people writing about the truth of war or violence, are writing. And so what can she contribute? What is it she's going to offer? And she says, well, these people writing about violence, these social scientists, make 2 mistakes, and that's why she thinks she can justify her intervention. The first mistake, she says, is that they reduce man to being an animal. So she says on page 157, quote, I fail to understand why we are asked to recognize that man behaves very much like a group territorial species. So the point is, these people study elephants or other animals, and they find that these animals protect their territory with violence. They'll fight for it. And they say, oh, see, man is just like an animal. But Arendt says, and she continues in the quote, I fail to understand why we do this rather than the other way around, namely that certain animal species behave very much like men. She says, why do we say, well, animals are violent, men are violent, so we behave like animals? It could be the other way around. Animals are violent, men are violent, animals sometimes act like men. Why do we hold the animal as the standard? And she offers a one-sentence, brutal answer to this question. She says the answer, this is on page 157 again, the answer, I'm afraid, is simple. It is easier to experiment with animals, right? And not because the way we usually think of it, which is that for humanitarian reasons, that it's not nice to put humans in a cage. No, it's easier to experiment on animals, she says, because the trouble is men can cheat. It's hard to experiment on men because men are free. They can upset the experiment. They can cheat. And it's that freedom which makes it hard to experiment on men. So we experiment on animals and then we reduce men to animals. But she says there's obviously a big difference. Men have a kind of freedom to act in ways that are surprising and unexpected that animals do not. The second problem with the social science research, she says, is that in looking at the aggressiveness of animals, which the social scientists say is necessary for their self-preservation, man no longer needs that kind of aggressiveness for his self-preservation, she says, so he represses these natural instincts and great violence emerges. And the science then seeks to cure man of this kind of repressed outburst of violence by manipulating and controlling our instincts, usually by finding harmless outlets for them after their life-promoting function has disappeared. Once we no longer need violence, we try and find other outlets for our violence, computer games or other things like that. And again, she says, why are we holding up animals as the standard? Okay, this is largely throat clearing, but it's important because it shows Hannah Arendt's attempt to understand violence not through social science, but through other means. She then has a couple of points about violence that again are not absolutely essential to her argument, but I think are instructive and worth thinking about all on their own. One is that rage and violence can be just, right? So one of the things that is often said about violence and this essay on violence is that she's against violence. And yet it's important to realize that she says, no, violence can be justified. It's a means to an end. And there are times when violence is just. So, for example, on page 161, she says, the point is that under certain circumstances, violence, and she here defines violence as acting without argument or speech and without counting the consequences. So acting in ways that you don't justify what you're doing, you just act. And you don't think about the consequences or justify it, is the only way to set the scales of justice right again. Sometimes you just have to act violently because that's what the situation calls for. And the example she gives is Billy Budd. He's accused of murder and he can't speak and he lashes out and strikes Claggart dead. You can also think of the Count of Monte Cristo and Stories of Revenge, in which it's just thought, well, clearly a wrong was done. There needs to be a response. And so she says sometimes violence is just. She says that rage and violence are only irrational, right? They're means that can be rationalized, but they're only irrational when they are turned against substitutes. So we are angry at one person, but we don't take out our anger and our violence against them. We take it out on someone else. And the example she gives of that is when we use the idea of collective guilt. So the traditional example in her writing for this is to say that all Germans are guilty for the Holocaust. And she says this is an obfuscation And what it does is it actually prevents us from finding those Germans who were guilty, who did do horrible things, to be morally and legally culpable. And so she writes, where all are guilty, no one is. Confessions of collective guilt are the best possible safeguard against the discovery of culprits, and the very magnitude of the crime is the best excuse for doing nothing. If you say that everyone is guilty, all Germans, then no one is, and we never will actually find the culprits. She's here applying this in the 1960s in America to the question of racism. And what she's saying is to say that all whites are guilty of racism does the same thing as saying all Germans were guilty of genocide. She says all white men are guilty is not only dangerous nonsense, but also racism in reverse, and it serves quite effectively to give the very real grievances and rational emotions of the Negro population an outlet into irrationality and escape from reality. These are controversial statements. We're happy to talk about them. Her point here is simply that to say that all white men are guilty prevents us from actually finding those white men who are racist to be racist. It allows them to hide, just as it allows Germans to hide, to say all Germans are guilty. And it provides an excuse for doing nothing, because if everyone's guilty, no one is guilty. It also, she says, allows blacks in this case, or Jews in Germany, to assume, therefore, that their problems are all based on the fact that everyone is guilty. And that's what she calls an outlet into irrationality and escape from reality. And again, we can talk about whether she's right about this or not, but it's important to try and understand her statements. The next little discussion that she has about violence here in part 3 is on page 163, where she's talking about hypocrisy. This is a theme that she comes to take very seriously throughout the early 1960s. She writes a lot about it in her book On Revolution, and she writes about it here. And the core term is unmasking. And she says about hypocrisy here, to tear the mask of hypocrisy from the face of the enemy, to unmask him and the devious machinations and manipulation, so that permit him to rule without using violent means. That is, to provoke action even at the risk of annihilation, so that the truth may come out. These are still among the strongest motives in today's violence on the campuses and in the streets. What she's talking about here is those activists and others who say of the government, oh, you're saying you're just keeping order, you're saying you're doing good, you're hypocrites, you're actually trying to keep your power, you're actually trying to uphold the upper class, you're trying to justify your oppression of the rest of society. And of course, that's true. All power wears a mask. In fact, she would go further and say all public people, insofar as they're in public, wear a mask, and they act as citizens, they act as equals that make us who we are not, because we're all unequal in reality. In any case, she thinks it's absolutely necessary for power and for individuals to wear a mask in public. But it's also, therefore, true to unmask people, because they're always wearing a mask. They're always portraying themselves to be who they are not in public. The problem with this idea of unmasking, she writes, and I'll just continue on page 163, is that this violent reaction against hypocrisy, however justifiable in its own terms, because it is true that everyone is disingenuous and wearing a mask, this violent reaction loses its raison d'etre when it tries to develop a strategy of its own with specific goals. As soon as those people who claim hypocrisy become in power, and they try and then have a strategy, have goals, they become hypocrites as well. And so the claim of hypocrisy, she writes, becomes irrational the moment it is rationalized. That is, the moment the reaction in the course of a contest turns into an action, and the hunt for suspects, accompanied by the psychological hunt for ulterior motives, begins. Once you make hypocrisy an evil, there's no one who's not a hypocrite. And we look in everyone for ulterior motives, for why they're doing what they say is good, and we attack them and their motives and not what they're doing. And this kind of ad hominem attack the person, not the idea, or attack the person, not the action, is the danger of hypocrites. The point is that justifying violence in the name of hypocrisy will simply lead to an unending cycle of violence. And the quintessential example of that is the terror in the French Revolution, which is always her example of hypocrisy. She then turns, and again, she's just doing a couple of different discussions of violence here, but she then turns to the question of collective violence, citing a number of writers, including Fanon and Sorel, and argues that collective violence can indeed be attractive. At times, death, which is something that to experience individually or singularly is deeply lonely and impotent. To die alone is to die meaningless, it seems. But if we die fighting together with our comrades, our brothers on a battlefield, the band of brothers idea, our life and our death has a kind of meaning. And so she writes on page 165, death indicates an extreme loneliness and impotence, but faced collectively and in action, death changes its countenance. Now nothing seems more likely to intensify our vitality than its proximity. So the point is that violence as a collective can actually provide meaning in life and be quite attractive. The problem, she says, is that those who take this argument and this true insight about the attractiveness of collective violence and try to extend it so that it becomes an argument for a hope of a political society that is given meaning through violence. And she says the reason so many people have been misled by this idea of the meaningfulness of collective violence is that they think that it will lead to a new community or a new man. And yet they're wrong, because this is an illusion, she says. The hope is an illusion for the simple reason that no human relationship is more transitory than this kind of brotherhood. The kind of brotherhood that emerges from collective violence is fleeting. And it can only be actualized, she says, under conditions of immediate danger to life and limb. This is on page 166. At which point, she says, what kind of political community can we live in which we're always risking our life? You couldn't live that way. And so the idea that this would become a political ideal is an illusion. She then has a very interesting and somewhat off, I think, on the other side, a little off our argument, 1 or 2 page digression about intellectuals and the power and revolutionary class. Intellectuals are going to be the revolutionary class of the future. This is part of her critique of intellectuals, which runs through her work. And it ends with this quote, "For better or worse, and I think there is every reason to be fearful as well as hopeful, the really new and potentially rebel class and their potential power as yet unrealized is very great, perhaps too great for the good of mankind." This is on page 170. Why is it that intellectuals may have power that is too great for the good of mankind? It's primarily because intellectuals, because they rationalize and think, get caught up in theories and don't actually confront the real world as it is. They don't know how to say what through comments. They get caught up in theories, and they then can get so excited about their theories, whether it's Marxism or anti-communism in Vietnam, which is one thing she has in mind, that they'll go and justify incredible violence in the name of theories, and seem to lose touch with the ends and means arguments for violence. The final part of part 1 of chapter 3 of this essay on violence is simply that she raises the question of the danger of organic metaphors of violence, that it's creative and it's a natural force. And she thinks this is particularly dangerous in questions of race and racism. Okay, this brings us to page 176 and part 2 of this third part of the essay. And she begins with what I read earlier, this quote, that quote, violence, being instrumental by nature, is rational to the extent it is effective in reaching the end that must justify it. So now we're actually saying, okay, what is violence? It's instrumental and it's rational, and thus it must be justified by its ends. But then she continues, and this is the limitation on the rationality of violence. Since when we act, we never know with any certainty the eventual consequences of what we are doing. So when we act, we can't know how the action will end up. I mean, one action will lead to so many reactions and further actions, we don't know what the result is going to be. The result of that, she says, is that violence can only be rational as an end justified by means, as a means justified by ends. It can only be rational if it pursues short-term goals, right? So violence can be rational. It can dramatize grievances and bring them to public attention. So if you have a violent protest against police brutality, it can actually accomplish something. It can bring injustices to appear in the world. And thus it can even ensure a hearing for moderation, right? If there's police violence going on, police brutality going on, violence can actually say, let's be moderate. Short term. It has to work quickly. And the result is that if the ends take longer, they usually won't work. And so she says what violence ends up doing is leading to short-term fixes and not long-term structural changes. And so she says on page 177, no doubt violence pays. It could be rational. But the trouble is that it pays indiscriminately. And here she offers these two examples which have caused her all sorts of trouble, and people have accused her of being racist for them. She says, violence in the 60s by black students on campuses got courses in Swahili and got students admitted who were unqualified. And she says, again, these were short-term fixes that diffused the violence, but actually didn't solve the real problem of racial inequality at the university or in society. The result of this short-term of violence is that violence has to work quickly. And she says on page 177, I think in one of the more insightful quotes of this whole essay, if goals are not achieved rapidly through violence, the result will be not merely defeat, but the introduction of the practice of violence into the whole body politic. Namely, violence has to work quickly. And if it does, it can actually be rational and achieve its goals. But if it doesn't work quickly, you keep adding more violence, it gets more violent, and the only real change that you bring about is that society becomes ever more violent. And that's the danger of using violence to achieve your ends. And so she continues, the practice of violence, like all action, does change the world, but the most probable change is to a more violent world. Again, the point is violence is rational, but it must be short term. If it doesn't work quickly, it will lead to an escalation of violence and to a more violent world. And this, I think, is her ultimate worry about violence in this essay. She concludes with a final few pages on, again, returning to some of the themes in part one of the essay about why violence is attractive today, from the 1960s, I think, up to the moment. And she gives a couple of reasons. One is that bureaucracy is the form of government which everybody is deprived of political freedom or of the power to act. And as the world becomes more bureaucratic, we all feel powerless, impotent. We live under what she calls a rule of nobody, which is not no rule, but where we all feel powerless. And in such a world, violence gives us a feeling of power, of acting. It gives us the sense that we're actually doing something in a world in which we constantly feel disempowered and impotent. And she can write on page 180, I'm inclined to think that much of the present glorification of violence is caused by severe frustration of the faculty of action in the modern world. We feel disempowered, we feel frustrated, and we turn to violence. She ends with this, I guess, somewhat hopeful turn, where she says, what we really need is a new beginning, a new example, a new way to act that can resist the kind of bureaucratization and centralization and disempowering and making impotent of man in the 20th and now 21st century. And she says, we do not know if the kinds of protests and civil disobedience that we saw in the 60s, and we could also talk about it today with Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party and Bernie Sanders campaign and the Black Lives Matter campaign, are these occurrences the beginnings of something new, a new example, a new kind of action, or are they the death pangs of a faculty that mankind is about to lose, namely the faculty of action? And she leaves it at that, with the hope that we might actually be seeing something new, but with the very possibility that we're simply watching the dying out of the very idea of human action. So with that, I leave you and look forward to our conversation on Friday. Thanks very much.